Welcome to a new episode of Master Your Mistakes. Today we have Dr. Charles Armitage. Charles is CEO and co-founder of Florence. Florence is a platform for helping health and social care organizations manage, optimize, and train their workforce. Charles is going to talk about some of the big mistakes that he's made on his career, some of the lessons that he's learned, and maybe go off on a few tangents on the way. Charles, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Jesse. Pleasure to be here.
Perfect. Okay, diving straight in. What are the three mistakes that you'd like to speak about today?
Well, I've made a lot of mistakes in my life and the journey so far in building Florence. I think there are some that are ones that you can learn from quickly and kind of come back from, and there's a bucket of ones that are pretty hard to come back from. So I think I'm going to tell you about a mistake that's very hard to recover from, a mistake that I've learned from, and probably a mistake that I'm continuing to learn from today.
Cool. Okay. Appreciate that overview. To give our listeners a bit of a background on your entrepreneurial journey, could you tell us how you made that switch from doctor and healthcare to entrepreneurship?
Sure. So I was relatively early in my career as a doctor. So I was probably only about 3-4 years post-university, and was at a sort of, I don't know if you know much about how doctors are kind of progressed in this country, but I was at a sort of natural break in my training. I was kind of just finished one job and was moving on to the next one. And I was, it was a combination of push and pull factors. So on one hand, was feeling a bit dissatisfied with the job that I was doing and the career path I was looking down. And I can go into more detail, but, essentially, a career in medicine, while fantastic, really admirable, and for a lot of people is great, for me was a really constraining and restrictive thing. It's very it's very preordained and preset, and you go through a linear progression year after year. You get numbers after your name, so you'll be ST1, ST2, ST3. You have to fulfill certain criteria to get to the next stage, and while for some people that's quite a rewarding way of working, for me it felt incredibly restrictive. And so I was probably in my late 20s, and I was kind of staring down the barrel of 15 years of that kind of training progression, and some of the challenges of the job that are probably pretty well documented. And so it was kind of looking around for side projects to do, and I've always enjoyed building things, and have kind of had a history of trying entrepreneurial ventures and building stuff. So was working on a project to kind of try and build an app within the department I was working with to help us swap shifts with each other and create a staff bank. And at the same time, I met my co-founder, Dan, who was at the time involved in running a housing charity that had some care homes, and they're having some problems with their staff recruitment. So a big reliance on agency staff. So we got together in the middle of 2016, met in the Plough in Clapham, a pub, kind of talked through a few different ideas together, started to work on some things, going backwards and forwards for a bit, and then a couple of weeks later we decided to jump in to build the company together.
Okay, so that's quite maybe compared to some other journeys, that's quite it seems like a short distance between idea inception and then agreeing with your co-founder, yep, we're going to go ahead on this.
I guess it was. The end idea we ended up going down as our first product was very much that was what Dan had already been working on that a bit. So kind of came with a bit of a run up, and he put a bit of money in, and we were at different stages in our life. So he was, he had young kids. So, and I was, as I say, just finished a job, and I was able to continue to pick up locum shifts to earn some extra money. So I was in quite a fortunate position that I had very low overheads, low burn, and was able to work, a couple of night shifts a week to make enough money to live, whilst I could spend the rest of my time building the company. And I didn't have any kids, didn't really have any responsibilities. So it was quite easy for me to go all in. And so, when we started, I definitely didn't look at it thinking, this is going to be the next sort of 8, 10, whatever years of my life. It seemed like a cool side project, and we were just going to give it 6 months and see how it went. And I guess by that waypoint, we'd got quite a lot of momentum, and so just kept going. But I never really it's interesting, I never actually really made the conscious decision to be I'm done with medicine, I'm doing this now. It felt more like a career break for me.
Makes sense. And do you think, or have you experienced anyone in your peer group space, specifically doctors, who have gone down a similar route, or is it quite atypical?
No, I've had quite a lot of my peer group who are doctors have left clinical medicine and gone into adjacent fields. They tend to work in, healthcare adjacent fields. So either in some sort of like health technology, healthcare sort of adjacent management services, or like investment, or building companies like Florence that serves healthcare institutions. So yeah, it's relatively common amongst my cohort actually.
Interesting. And then in terms of the mistakes,
Yeah.
could you dive us or take us straight into that first mistake?
So I was thinking about this and mistakes that you can make. So I think there are very few mistakes or categories of mistake in your life that you can't come back from. But there is one type of mistake that's almost impossible to reverse, and I think that's kind of related to like bringing new life into the world. So who you choose to have kids with is a one-way door, right? Once the kid's out, you guys are stuck together, and you've got to live with that decision. And luckily, haven't made any mistakes there. So happy in my marriage with my two wonderful kids. But I think a very similar thing applies to when you're actually starting a company. And the point where you find people like your co-founders and incorporate the company and set up your cap table and build your articles and your shareholder agreement and things like that is a uniquely important time, because not only does it set like the baseline of foundations for the company going forward, but you're actually in probably your period of least knowledge and most vulnerable to making those kind of mistakes. So I'll give you an example. So when we started Florence, we had actually, it was kind of it was more than me and Dan. We had another sort of like co-founder, inverted commas, who started off on the journey with us and turned out to like not really be providing any value. And very quickly we realized that it wasn't a good fit with in the company together. But by that point, we'd already, let's say that took 6 months or whatever. By that point, we'd already incorporated the company. We handed out sort of like divvied out the shares between us, done all the incorporation documents, signed everything. So it was all documented on paper, and it's basically impossible once someone has shares in your company to take them back without like a large legal process or indeed like exchanging money. And that's obviously really challenging, because you hear about this concept of like dead equity quite a lot, and it's a very common thing where a group of co-founders will get together, work on a project together, and realize that one out of the three or whatever the number is isn't necessarily a good fit. And if you structure that initial incorporation in the wrong way, then that becomes a challenge to manage. Like we ultimately ended up sorting it out a few years later when we did a funding round. We kind of ended up buying out that early co-founder at a bit of a discount, but it ended up being very expensive and quite challenging to deal with.
And when you're approaching investors, either early on or at a big funding round, what's their view when they see something akin to debt equity?
It's a real turnoff. It's a real turnoff because ultimately, to some extent, equity behaves a bit like something like, I don't know, Bitcoin. There's a finite supply, right? Like, okay, obviously you can issue more shares, but it comes with the dilutive effects to everyone else. So especially in the early stages, if, one of the key things that investors need to look at is essentially what they're backing is, especially in the early stages, they're backing the founders and they're backing longevity of the founders. So if you've got founders that, day one, first equity investment are already hold less than 20% of the company, as you go through future fundraising rounds and go through the dilution there, like it's going to become, they're going to get diluted away. And ultimately, everyone responds to incentives. And when the going gets tough and you're like many years in and you kind of suddenly look at the cap table and be like, well, I don't really have much of this company left. The incentive to go and do something else, start fresh is quite large. So yeah, 100%, like in early rounds. And it's especially a risk if there's like multiple co-founders, because there's only one founder, right? They're going to have 100% day one, so that you dilute 20%, they've got 80% left. But if you've got three co-founders each with 33%, let's say, and you dilute 20%, people are getting to like relatively small numbers. And so Yeah, it's definitely a thing. And you know, if you go through the traditional sort of like pre-seed, seed, Series A, Series B onwards kind of funding trajectory, you know, you're going to be giving away 15-20% of the company at every one of those funding rounds. So the dilutive effect, especially if you're growing quickly, can be really significant. Now, you hope that the overall valuation increases significantly faster than the rate of dilution, but still, it's a risk. Mm-hmm. So I guess like my commentary on that is, you know, I think, I mean, there are different ways to deal with it, right? Like if you're going to found a company with someone else, which I think has been, you know, one of the best founding decisions we made was, you know, me choosing Dan choosing me. We've had a like very strong, extremely strong co-founding relationship for, you know, 9 years now, that works really, really well. But that was really lucky because we didn't know each other before. We never worked together. We didn't know our sort of like values alignment and kind of what we wanted out of the company or out of our working lives. It just so happened that those things were really aligned. But I think that's very infrequent. I think you can normally, if you go into an accelerator or meet someone on the internet or a networking event and decide to co-found a company together, you literally don't know them from Adam. And so the risk that the relationship isn't going to work out is extremely high. So I guess like point one would be, you know, ideally only found companies with someone that you know really well for a long time. Failing that, do some like serious work together before you put anything on paper. So
what would be some examples of that serious kind of work that you could do together? Would it be like really intense conversations like back and forth, or would you like try and do a pilot project or something like that?
Yeah, I would try and work on building the company, work on your idea together and build it. But like, you know, I mean, it's not a one size fits all here, but you know, you don't need to paper the agreement and then start doing the work together. I would start doing the work together. And after you've worked with someone for, like, you know, like if you've worked for someone like for 12, 14 hours a day for a month, 2 months, you'll have a very good idea of what they're going to be like to work with going forward. Like, you know, are they smart? What are their values and the priorities? Like, do they have good follow up? Do they execute? Like all these kind of like basic levels of things that are super important to have in place. You'll know after a month or two whether that's the case, whether you're having to chase them for stuff or the work's crap, like low quality, or, you know, they can't speak to customers or whatever the issues are. That will get surfaced pretty quickly.
On the values piece, are there any values where actually you and Dan might differ, but that actually becomes a strength in the way that you might focus on different things?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think like the things that we're aligned on are super important. So we're very aligned on like some, and I'm not just saying this, some like core things. Like number one, it's like we don't take it too seriously. So, you know, it's important. It's like customers and it's people's lives and things like that. But like ultimately, you know, I think we both have the same idea of like we want to have some fun, and that probably is one of the sort of underlying kind of core parts of our relationship. Is that, you know, if it doesn't work out, hey, so what? You know, it's been fun. So that's one. I think two, we have similar sort of levels of work ethic and like focus on execution, which is like important. If there's a real disparity there, that's challenging. At the moment, I've got very young kids, so struggle to keep up sometimes. But broadly, we're aligned there. Like we do have differences in like how we. Oh yeah, sorry. The third thing we're very aligned is I think we're pretty aligned on like, you know, expectations of how people should treat each other. You know, it's not like one of us like shouting and one of us is conflict averse or something. I think we're pretty stable on that front, and maybe people that work at Florence might think differently, but I think we're broadly aligned there. Where we're a bit different is, you know, just comes down to, I guess, what we reach to first when we're trying to solve problems. So for example, if I'm trying to work out what's going on or something's not working, my first thing I'll reach to is some data, and I'll, you know, try to pull up numbers and, you know, explore a numerical side of it. Dan's gut would be to go and speak to a customer. And I think actually both of those are like really important levers you can pull in like a diagnostic process. And, you know, we're married together. I think that's really powerful. It's not like I don't speak to customers. It's not like Dan doesn't look at data, but but we just sort of fit into those kind of like niche strengths, and it means that you get both the sort of the qualitative and quantitative like diagnosis of what's going on.
And on that qualitative side, are there any tricks of the trade that you might have learned from Dan, or even vice versa, from like sales calls, customer relationships, pitches to investors?
What, from Dan?
From Dan.
Dan's superpower is he's very good at building trust with people really quickly, and I've tried to work better than me, and I've kind of tried to like distill and break down like why that is. What he does, one little trick of the trade that he does that's great to watch is he's very good at like giving without any expectation of receipt. So he will often, frequently go out of his way to help people, whether that's people he might ultimately want something from, like a customer, or people just in his network that he knows. He'll regularly go out of his way and like pinpoint, try and help them with something, or think of an opportunity and kind of put them in the right spot. And like, you only need to do that once or twice, and like builds a huge amount of trust with people. And he does it very well with customers as well, because he can very quickly turn a relationship from a sort of transactional like buyer-seller relationship into a very sort of collaborative, almost like conspiratorial relationship, which can be really useful. So he's very good at that.
Makes sense. And is there anything, if you could not be humble at all, that he might have learned from you?
I actually can't think of anything. It's very hard to self-reflect like that. But
is there anything that he's complimented you on? Do you ever remember like a specific compliment from Dan and you being like, actually, yeah, he's probably right about that?
Yeah, well, maybe he's once said that I'd be a good CFO or something.
Okay.
No, yeah, it's probably related to that numbers side of things. I think he probably recognizes my strength and interest in, the numerical makeup of businesses and the underlying mechanics and how that works. And I think he probably doesn't interest him in the same way, but I think he recognizes my strength there, and therefore like leaves me to it, I guess.
Makes sense. And then what would be mistake number 2?
Okay, mistake number 2, probably again related to like the very early days of Florence. So back when we started the company in 2017, we knew absolutely nothing about the sort of process or craft of entrepreneurship and building a business, especially in like the technology world. And I think there's a lot more material and content around today about processes to follow and how to build products and how to investigate whether the problems exist. But back then there was a handful of books that were sort of like required reading, like the Lean Startup and things like that, which is still obviously required reading. But we were just kind of making it up as we went along. And we made the, cardinal error number 1, which was, day one, I think, I can't remember exactly how much money Dan put in, but it was, low tens of thousands. And we said, right, well, we need to build this app, which in 2017 was a lot harder than it is today. And so, we went on the internet onto Fiverr or Upwork or something to try and find a freelance like developer to build a piece of technology for us. And obviously knew zero about, both the technical engineering requirements of like, what language should this be written in? And also, which was, back then a relatively important decision, as also the, like how you build a product, right? And so I remember we had, we were like, okay, well, this app needs to do these like 50 things. It needs to be able to, onboard nurses. They need to be able to upload these different certificates and documents. It needs to like handle payments. It needs to handle payments between different like electronic wallets. It needs to have, all these really complicated like matching components and like really, really complicated features. But when I look back now, I'm like, oh my God, that's like years of work to build this thing. And we, we went on to Upwork, find a, freelancer who could do it. And obviously if you go out to the whole internet and say, oh, we'll pay you someone 20 grand to do this thing, someone's going to say, yes, I'll do it. And it was an absolute shit show. And, we ended up spending months and months trying to go through this process. Like, developers disappeared for a bit, came back, spent all our money, didn't get anything delivered, finally got something approaching an application, and took it to a sort of like first customer, and it was just like totally wrong. Like, we'd completely missed the point of what we were trying to do or the problem they were solving for. And so, we definitely, so that was all of our money, right? So we were stuck at that point. We had a customer that had been waiting for this app for ages. We got the app, it didn't work, and we couldn't really do anything about it because we didn't have any more money to spend. So, that was definitely sort of like a pain point and a low point. And, but you learn a load in the product development process. I mean, the positive thing from that was that whilst this app was, being built in the background, we were spending a lot of time with customers, right? And so I was, hitting the phone, getting meetings with nursing homes who were our first customers, spending time with them, working out what they're trying to do, like what their pain points were. So it meant that actually, even though the app didn't work, like we by that point then had a really good understanding of what the sort of like MVP core problem to solve was. Ended up just throwing the app in the bin and using a Google Sheet to do that kind of like first MVP and like some Zapier connections and things like that. And, that was enough to kind of validate the idea. Meant we could then, take that sort of like first customer, that product in inverted commas that was like Google Sheet plus Zapier plus HubSpot plus all these kind of like tools, raise some more money, and then actually build the thing properly.
Makes sense. And a lot of the problem solving there, as you said, there's a lot more content online, like particularly in the last few years. The lean startup is famous, but at the end of the day, it's like a physical copy of a book. So I'd imagine like on this journey, a lot of what you've learned is from your kind of like entrepreneurial network. And it seems to be the case that, tech CEOs know other tech CEOs. How did you build your network there?
That's actually like super true. Like, definitely the most valuable advice I get is from, like a couple of like WhatsApp groups of people with like similar stage and size companies who I have like relationships with, and like hands down the best, problem solving network that I have. Because, I think when you're building a company, a lot of the problems you face are like extremely stage specific. So when you're in the early state, when you're very early, like, you might have some, questions about like the legal side, like company incorporation or issuing shares or raising money. But a lot of your problems are like very product and customer focused. So very sort of like specific to your domain. Still with some overarching like themes around, how to build a product or, how to kind of build a brand or whatever it is. But they're quite specific. As you get to like later stages, like, Series A, B plus or whatever, the problem space becomes like much more unified across different customers. And I often find that like a problem I'm facing, if you find someone that's, that much bigger or more mature as an organization than you, they've probably dealt with that in the last sort of 18 months. And so I can go to the WhatsApp and go, does anyone, have any insights in, we want to launch in Australia. Does anyone know about XYZ in Australia? Normally someone will pipe up and go, this is good. These are some of the challenges. Watch out for this, speak to this person. And so having that kind of like collaborative network for people who are very stage specific to you is really relevant. I think it's less relevant. Like, the advice, if someone was sitting here today, just starting out building their company, maybe I can offer some sort of like, very high level advice, but it's quite far away. And the problems they're going to be dealing with, let's say I dealt with them like 7 or 8 years ago, like probably not particularly relevant, my knowledge or experience of it. So definitely build a network of people that are solving in your own space and at your own stage. And lean into that. How did I do that? We were lucky in that we got on a few like kind of like accelerator kind of government programs. One called like Upscale, one called Future 50, that did exactly that. They took Upscale was like, I think it was like 30 companies at the sort of Series A stage that had been like vetted and like allowed on. That was a really good program actually, and as part of it, went away for a couple of nights to some hotel in Oxfordshire and like did some workshops and things like that. But got drunk a few times, and that so you build a lot of trust and relationships there, and that today is still my like first like go-to port of call for any questions.
Makes sense. And now thinking about in the investor side of it,
Yeah.
how has that relationship changed as you've scaled, and what kind of lessons have you learned?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we've raised money in like a few different rounds from very different types of people. So early rounds was kind of like friends, family, angel investors, and a relatively larger number of people with like smaller tickets, and some of those guys I don't speak to very often at all. Some of them I speak to really frequently, super helpful, really help support the company and, help work for their investment, which is great. Love those guys. And then obviously more recently we've done some, Series A, Series B institutional rounds with like, funds with LPs and all those kind of things. And I guess like, being straightforward, like when everything goes to the venture model, which basically up until a few years ago was like a very well-trodden thing. It's changed a lot in the last few years. But, the idea would be that, a company raises a pre-seed round and a seed round, and there's 18 months between each round, and, the revenue's like doubling or tripling between each round. You go pre-seed, seed, Series A, Series B, Series C, and there's very clearly defined like metrics and waypoints for each one of those. And when that goes well, it's obviously great. And you look at like companies that have scaled through all those rounds really well and like, achieve huge valuations. But sometimes like for many, many reasons, companies can get to a certain stage of investment and have a bit of a speed bump. And that's happened to us to some extent. And, we raised some money in 2022, which just before a lot of the world changed. So just coming out of COVID, just before Russia invaded Ukraine, just before inflation kicked in. And certainly the inflation and the dynamic around interest rates really affected the venture funding model. So I mean, I can work it through, but essentially, like higher projected interest rates means that money moves out of the equity markets into things like bonds, which means valuations of public market software companies go down, which then tax down the stack to like private market companies. So a lot of like there was a huge constriction in venture funding, and we've kind of all gone through that over the last few years. And like I love our investors; they're great. They've been super supportive. But I guess one of the things I've probably realized about these like institutional investors is that they've got bosses too. So they've got a fund, they've got LPs that invest in that fund, and those LPs have given their money and rightly expect a return within a certain time frame. And so when things are all going up and to the right, and everyone's on the same page and happy with that trajectory, it's all good. But when that growth kind of stumbles and you don't get to the waypoint of the next funding round, or it takes you too long or whatever it is, suddenly you see those like individual incentives come through, and that can cause a little bit of tension and misalignments of like goals around those investors, which can be challenging to navigate.
And you, as a CEO, from almost a kind of like broad mindset perspective, how do you manage all those potential different stakeholders that have like different competing interests, different competing incentives versus, your opinion on how to tackle the problems of the day?
Well, not always easily. Not always easily, because it's like sometimes having 4 different bosses, and having one boss can be quite hard, but having 4 bosses that sort of want different things can be harder. And I guess it's a balance between, I guess, they would probably, whether they agree with this or not, like, my job isn't to do what I'm told. My job is to tell them what to do, take on their feedback, and then execute based on what I think is the right thing to do. And maybe that might not be aligned to some people around the table, but that's the game. And so, a lot of that kind of, I don't know, but there are subtleties to that kind of balance of power thing, depending on some of the consent rights that you have, or the amount of money around, amount that's been invested, or like the situation the company's in. Like, there's a lot of very subtle dynamic changes that happen. But ultimately, I think if I always try and reflect, what is in the best interests of the company as a whole, which is, our customers, our employees, our shareholders of all different types and classes. And if you're trying to make decisions that are in the long-term best interests of the company, then that's, I think, the only framework you can have.
Cool. I like that. That's cool. And now mistake number 3.
Mistake number 3. So this is actually probably a bit more related to like recent funding rounds. So I said we raised money in 2022, which was it was like the peak of like the tech venture market valuations. So there's a load of money being invested, huge valuations. It was also, in the world that we operate in, we had just grown massively because of COVID. So, broadly what we do at Florence is, help health and care organizations run their workforce, particularly at the time it was in their temporary workforce. And the demand for that skyrocketed during COVID because, as you can imagine, dynamics on the healthcare market was that they just needed a lot of staff, and we were able to help with that. And so 2021 and 2022, we grew loads. And if I look back at the graph now, it was like astounding, the level of growth. And it wasn't, although at the time we thought we just like cracked the equation, we were super clever. And maybe, we did execute relatively well. Like, a huge amount of that was driven by a fundamental shift in the market. And, when you're on the way up, riding that wave up, it's very hard to imagine that you're not in like a new world. And I guess, you can see this kind of pattern. I wouldn't say it's like a bubble, but like you can see this pattern repeating all over. Like back in the COVID times, right? Zoom, the video call went nuts. Everyone was like, well, obviously everyone's going to use Zoom forever. There's going to be no return to the office and no competitive dynamics, and Zoom's going to take over the world. Peloton went nuts because everyone was exercising at home, and all that, and all these dynamics around how the real estate market changed as people won't come to the office. At the time, it felt like these were things that were just going to be a change in how humans existed. It's turned out in hindsight that obviously that's completely wrong. And if you have a very rapid change in the status quo, like more often than not, you're going to return back to the normal on the other side. And that was the case for us. And we were slow to react to that. So we raised this money in 2022. We had been growing a lot and raised this money on the idea that we were going to continue growing a lot. So we were super aggressive. We were like, we're going to launch in 4 new countries at once. We're going to be, going from 100 staff to 300 people over the course of 12 months. Going to spend all this money. We're going to go out and hire all these expensive, CFOs and CROs and all these like marquee hires. It's like you should do in the venture playbook. And not realizing really that a lot of that growth was coming from this like temporary adjustment in the market that was at some point going to come back down to earth. And it did come back down to earth. And when it came back down to earth, it came down very quickly. And so there was a period of time where we had raised this money. It was probably 6 months afterwards, where we just saw the revenue growth that was going up very quickly, just start to level off and then turn into reverse. And it was at the same time that we were really increasing the cost base. So hiring all these people, taking on big office leases, launching new markets, And so within like a very short 2 or 3 month period, our burn just went like vroomf, and like really just like if you're projecting revenue to go like that and it turns the other way and your costs are going like that, it becomes very sticky very quickly. And so we obviously responded to that. We slowed down, but then what followed was basically a really painful 18 months of multiple rounds of like redundancies, headcount reductions, scaling back from markets, really trying to right size the cost base for that revenue as it kind of came back down to the kind of pre-COVID demand level. And I think at the time, I asked myself like frequently, like what decisions would we have done differently if we'd been through that situation again? And it's hard thinking back to those occasions. Like if I think back to the frame of mind we were all in, like we felt like totally invincible. And I can't imagine a world where we would have not made the decisions we made. But I've definitely, if I am ever in a business where we see a like basically an almost unexplained increase in revenue, or an increase in revenue that's explained by an external market condition rather than a change in how we execute or operate or our product, then really think about the stability and fragility of that change in the external market condition, and don't chase after it because it tends to come back down to earth. And actually, and I see that it's not just us that made that mistake. Like a load of cohorts of companies at similar stages, especially in COVID, which was such a strong, like such a substantial change to how like the world operated. Like I can think of so many companies that either went like this and then came back down to earth, or like died and then came back to life in a way that has actually really fucked them up now, because it's painful.
Interestingly enough, 2 episodes ago, a guest went through the exact same period.
Right.
A completely different sector. It was like social finance and impact bonds, but similar thing. I was going to ask you if you could go back and speak to, or rather, if today you met someone similar to yourself in that position, what would you do to kind of like really hammer home, like you need to think about the fundamentals here?
What happened to us in 2022?
Or if like next week you met, someone, a CEO of a company, their company is scaling, and they're going through this massive rocket period that may or may not continue. What kind of advice would you give to them to kind of shake some sense into them?
Yeah. It's really hard, because obviously if you're like going bananas and doing really well, no one wants to hear the pessimist or the person that's sort of like, doubting whether this is going to continue. I definitely wouldn't have back in the time. I remember, definitely, we were like very convinced that we were the only way that thing was going to happen was we were going to win, which we still are going to win. But we were we were pretty blinkered. So, what would I say in that situation? I think it would be, understand the core like market demand and drivers of the business, and like what has changed in those and what could change in the future, and just be a bit careful. So for us, right, like the core market changes and the core market drives in our business is like, is there a supply shortage of healthcare workers? If there are not enough healthcare workers, then we do well because we solve that problem. If you look long term, there's a structural problem around the healthcare workforce because people are living longer and we're not training enough of them. So there is a fundamental long-term supply-demand mismatch in the healthcare workforce. Like that's very easy to see. The problem is that in that like long 20, 30-year arc, there are like significant like policy changes that can come in that mean that number moves around, and that's what we've felt. And I think, for us, we didn't fully understand what were the drivers of the short-term drivers of supply and demand in that market. So I would reflect back in that situation. I would take the time to try and like model that out, be like, what is going on with the customers at like a unit level? Like, and actually, if you'd done the spreadsheet and looked back and seen that over a basically 3-month period, the revenue, the demand per customer more than doubled, just like that, you think that's unusual. I can't explain that. Why has that happened?
Makes sense. And now stepping away from Florence into software tech more broadly,
Yeah.
particularly, with, the use of Claude
Yeah.
or tools, etc.
Yeah.
Do you have any spicy hot takes on where things might be going?
I wouldn't, I'm not sure if I was starting another company now, whether I would start another technology company. As much as I love technology, I don't think that, you can already see now the defensibility within like software is decreasing hugely. And yeah, advantages are that, the cost of getting like a, software solution of some sort off the ground is like de minimis now, and with things like Lovable and Claude and all that, all these kind of like vibe coding things that can basically take non-technical people like me and like deploy like really useful tools. So that's great. It means the barriers to entry are low, but even today you can see that then defensibility piece is much harder, and the rate and speed of change is such that if I'm thinking about building a company, it's going to be at least 10 years. I think you're lucky if you manage to get a decent like exit or return away, or get to a sort of certain scale where you can make some money in like, anything substantially less than that. And so I feel that you've got to, for my next company, I would want to build something that I know is going to be a 10-year journey. And I have some line of sight over what the world looks like in 10 years, as to whether there's still going to be value in what we do. Now, that might be a very risk-averse position to take, but I just feel the rate of change is so great at the moment that, like, what am I interested in? I'm interested in things that are like fundamentally defensible against AI. So, we'll still need to eat food. We'll still need to like have real estate. People will still, if they in the healthcare world, they will still become ill and need to go to a hospital or a care home or whatever it is. And so looking, I think, at those like fundamental like human needs that will not change, people will still have leisure. People will still probably more leisure. Look at those fundamental human needs that will not change and build a business around those. That doesn't mean you can't like totally reinvent that and, create a much better customer experience and do it much more effectively and leverage AI and technology to, change the game in that kind of chosen domain. But I just think that, hospitals have more longevity at the moment than like a new CRM.
It's funny you said neo CRM, because that's what was exactly in my head, was like, okay, we'll still, in 10 years time, we'll still need a hospital. In 10 years time, will companies still need a CRM like they need?
Yeah.
now?
I mean, I think they will still need a CRM, but like, I've got no idea what it'll look like. It definitely won't look like, essentially what HubSpot is today, which is a series of tables joined together. I'm sure it will be fundamentally different to that. I don't know what that is though. But 10 years time, like, yeah, like the world's going to be very different.
Three final questions. What is the advice, independent of Florence, of entrepreneurship, or maybe even medicine? What is the advice that you would give yourself 10 years ago?
I think the advice I'd give myself 10 years ago is broadly what I did, which is like take risks and do things that give you energy. And I think that it's definitely something that I'm sure resonates with everyone, right? Like when you're doing something that gives you energy, you can just work, you can get so much work done. When you're doing something that, is not in your wheelhouse or doesn't give you energy, it's like, it's hard, it's hard to be, it's impossible to be great at that. And so, my advice would be that especially in your 20s, where your responsibilities are low, your burn is low, the downside risk of like doing something wrong or making mistakes is small. Like if you've got an itch to scratch, you should go and do it 100%. And if it fucks up, it fucks up. Who cares?
Excellent. And now thinking about yourself in 10 years time, what is the advice that you think your older self would give you now?
Yeah, I think they would say you're still young. So be grateful for that. I'll give you the context to that. So I guess like I feel like over the last few over the last few years, my life's changed quite a lot from like having kids, getting married, having kids, and it's great and I love it. But like it's a fundamentally different being like a guy with no responsibilities in your like late 20s and early 30s. Yeah, exactly. To a father of a family that needs to support, and they both have great pleasures and bring great joy. But I feel a lot older now than I did 5 years ago. And I think a lot of that feeling of age comes from like the feeling of like responsibility and also like not sleeping as well because of babies and stuff like that. But I feel a lot older now and, not exercising enough and all those kind of things that you kind of take for granted. You don't realize that you've got loads of time to do that stuff. So, so I feel old and tired at the moment. I think it's part of like having young kids or whatever. But I imagine the person 10 years away will probably look back at me and be like, man, you were so young. Like, stop thinking you're so old.
Yeah. I like that. That's cool. No, I really like that.
Because also I feel like, like how old am I? I'm like 30, 37 or something. And for the first time I always felt very young. For the first time I feel sort of suddenly start thinking about my age. But man, I'm only a third of the way through. I've got ages.
Yeah. And not even that, if you think that like life kind of only really starts when you like leave school, leave university, it's even fewer.
I have minimal consciousness pre-13,
Yep.
minimal agency pre-18. I was drunk from 18 to 21. And so like, yeah, exactly. I've only had 15 years of conscious living.
Yep. 15 years of conscious living. Okay. Final question. What is your favorite quotation and why?
My favorite quotation, it's quite a long quotation, but it's almost like a poem, piece of prose, like semi-religious text called the Desiderata that was like discovered somewhere. It's on the wall in my parents' downstairs toilet. So I, used to as a kid read it every day. But I would check it out. It's it's a few hundred words long, where it's like go placidly amidst the noise and haste and remember what peace there may be in silence as far as possible. And it goes on like that, but it's a very good instruction manual for how you should live your life. So check out the Desiderata.
I like that. Could you pull out maybe one line or a couple of words from it? You know what? If you even, I don't know how long it is, but if you read it from your phone, it would be pretty intense, but I think it'd be cool.
Quite a sort of like placid thing. Sort of like imagine like, I don't know, a priest is giving this to you, and it's like it has a sort of quasi-religious bent. That's not necessarily my thing, but it's important. So go placidly amidst the noise and haste, and remember what peace there may be in silence. As far as possible, without surrender, be on good terms with all persons. Speak your truth quietly and clearly, and listen to others. Even the dull and ignorant, they too have their story. Avoid loud and aggressive persons. They are vexatious to the spirit. If you compare yourself with others, you may become vain or bitter, for always there will be greater and lesser persons than yourself. Enjoy your achievements as well as your plans. Keep interest in your own career, however humble. It is a real possession in the changing fortunes of time. Exercise caution in your business affairs, for the world is full of trickery, but let this not blind you to what virtue there is. Many persons strive for high ideals, and everywhere life is full of heroism. Be yourself, especially do not feign affection, neither be cynical about love, for in the face of all aridity and disenchantment, it's as perennial as the grass. Take kindly the counsel of the years, gracefully surrendering the things of youth. Nurture strength of spirit to shield you in sudden misfortune, but do not distress yourself with dark imaginings. Many fears are born of fatigue and loneliness. Beyond a wholesome discipline, be gentle with yourself. You are a child of the universe, no less than the trees and the stars. You have a right to be here. And whether or not it's clear to you, no doubt the universe is unfolding as it should. Therefore, be at peace with God, whatever you conceive him to be, and whatever your labours and aspirations. In the noisy confusion of life, keep peace with your soul. With all of its sham, drudgery, and broken dreams, it's still a beautiful world. Be cheerful, strive to be happy.
Excellent.
There you go.
I really appreciate that. My favorite line being everywhere, or I think it was everywhere there is heroism.
Yeah. And everywhere life is full of heroism. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think, what resonates to me, like nurture the strength of spirit to shield you in sudden misfortune. So, you know, build your resilience because everyone has misfortune, but don't distress yourself with dark imaginings. Many fears are born of fatigue and loneliness.
I like that. Charles, thank you very much for your time.
Anytime, Jesse. Thanks for having me.
Perfect. Oh, I love that you read that out. I love that. That's so good. I know you're
Shame I hadn't committed it to memory. I could, do a piece of camera.